Welcome to my review of Cosmic Cop for the arcade. And this is a shooter by Irem, creators of the R-Type series. So there's a very good background here with the games that this company's created. And, this is definitely a high-quality game by them. It has a unique mechanic where your secondary shot is this laser that tracks onto the enemy, as you see there. And as you power it up, you get more beams that track onto multiple enemies. So it's a unique mechanic because whenever you use that homing beam, you can't use your regular shot. So it kind of forces you to adapt to specific situations and decide when you're going to use the homing as opposed to your more powerful straight shot. The straight shot does a lot more damage, but the homing laser, tracks onto the enemy and it allows you to move away from the enemy and, into safer areas. So you'll do less damage, but you'll be able to get more consistent damage on the bosses and enemies. So there's definitely a strategy involved with trying to get through the stages and decide what you're going to use. So it's a pretty unique mechanic. You also have some bombs that you can drop below you. And there's also some missiles that you can get that kind of fire straight, which do a little bit of extra damage. But the main damage you're going to be dealing out is from your straight shot most of the time. That does the most damage. One limitation of the game is that your up and down movement is a little bit slow and sluggish. So that's one thing I didn't like about the game, because trying to dodge some stuff, it's harder because of that slower movement. But other than that, the left and right movement is good. Your hitbox is a little bit large since your ship is so large. There's a big area where you can take damage, but it's not a huge problem because the game is designed pretty well around that. So you're not having to fit in any, you don't really have to do any weird shit where you have to try to fit in, tiny gaps and stuff like that. That's not designed well for the game. So I wouldn't consider it a problem for this game. If you get hit on your actual laser turret, it will disconnect from the ship. I believe it's a specific area of the ship that has to get damaged for that to happen. So in that case, you can take 2 hits, but you lose the ability to use your laser. But most of the time, it's one-hit death. I rarely had that happen to where my laser got sniped off. You can bump into the ceilings and walls as long as you don't get crushed against the screen. Then you'll die. If the screen scrolls and you get crushed into a wall, then you'll automatically die. This was one of the hardest bosses in the game. This can be quite tough. You see I died there. It's actually a really tough fight, but very cool. But it's a lot of memorization as far as, getting your positioning right. So it took some trial and error. If I remember right, I think this game took me either 3 or 4 hours to complete. So, it has some parts that are quite difficult, but for an old arcade shooter, it's one of the easier ones overall. Some of them are brutally difficult that I've completed. And, this one is has 2 parts that were really hard. This fight took me about an hour, so it wasn't extreme. And the last boss took me about 2 hours. So, I think the game took me around 4 hours. I have a tutorial up of the game as well that breaks all my strategies down. So check that out if you're interested. I'll leave a link to that in the description. I really like the art style of the game. Really detailed pixel art. Soundtrack is pretty good, but not nearly as memorable as the R-Type games. The game is very forgiving with checkpoints, so you of course have infinite continues. There's no cheap tricks at the end of the game where you suddenly get cut off from having unlimited continues, as a few arcade games have done to me, where they give you unlimited continues, then you get to the last stage and suddenly no more continues, and you got to start the beginning of the game. This doesn't have any cheap tricks like that, so it's consistent with the way it's set up as far as the penalties. And pretty much all the stages have frequent checkpoints, so you never have to get too far to get to the next checkpoint, which makes the game quite easier than a lot of old arcade games. Now, I wouldn't call it a beginner shooter by any means, but for players who are moderately decent at shoot 'em ups, this is a good place to start. If you're looking for an arcade shooter that's not extremely brutal, on the higher end would be something like Gunsmoke, which I've mentioned before was an extreme game that I did a tutorial for as well. And somewhere in the middle, there's games like R-Type Leo, which are R-Type Leo is quite a difficult game for a side-scrolling shooter. If you compare it to other console shooters, of that style, it's quite hard. This is much easier than that. So this is kind of kind of moderate for an arcade shooter, but still a tough game if you're not especially good at shooters. And it's gonna be a tough game. It's not a beginner game. But if you're decent at shooters, then most of the game will probably be pretty easy for you, except for maybe a few parts that I mentioned. The boss where the screen is scrolling really quick, you really have to have that memorized and have it down. And the final boss can be quite tough. And this is actually the final boss right here. So first you have to fight these guys, which it's easy once you have it down. It's just some slight movements, and I break it all down in the tutorial. So you fight these guys first. Now the final boss is tough because the timer is already running, and if that bottom right timer goes down, the one that says 3,000, if that goes all the way down, you automatically lose. So the hardest part about this battle, it's tricky enough to dodge the turrets shooting at you constantly, but the hardest thing about it is on top of all that, you have to beat this thing very quickly. So you got to make sure you're getting your straight shots in very quickly on this main core of the boss when the gate opens. But it also shoots a laser as soon as it opens, so you got to kind of circle around all that while taking everything out. Quite a challenging boss fight. But a very cool way to end the game. And I really like this game. I thought it was really good. It's also kind of fun because you progress at a nice steady clip throughout the game. Since the checkpoints are so close together, you always feel like you're making progress, which is very cool. And it does have a few challenging spots, but overall it's a very fun game to play through. And it's a good game for intermediate players of shooters. It is short, though. It only takes maybe, if I remember right, it might only be something like 15 minutes to beat, maybe 20 minutes. I have it in my tutorial, the game length, but it's quite a short game. So it would really benefit from being a lot longer, probably about 4 times the length. Maybe, I think it should be at least an hour long. But I still really had a lot of fun with the game, and I thought it was really good. So for me, I'm going to give the game a 7 out of 10. I think it's a good, solid shooter. And one of the better arcade shooters as far as, a fun game to play. Let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.